Yeah, hi there. This is David. That's actually a photo of me with a real elephant. That is not Photoshop. That is real. Anyways, welcome to this presentation on trauma and what we call ACEs, or rather adverse childhood experiences, and how they contribute to trauma and the trauma response. And this is actually the elephant in the room because a lot of people have had trauma, but they've never really been diagnosed. They don't understand what it is. They don't know how detrimental it can be because it literally manifests the survival response, and it colors one's life with this state of always trying to want to survive and never really getting out of that state. So it's one of the things that really messes manifesting a lot and getting, it's one of the things that it's one of the biggest reasons why we get in our own way, especially those who've had ACEs. Now we'll cover all that, and what I want to do here is I want to share what I've learned in my 20 plus years of wrestling with this matter. Most of those years, I didn't even know what the word trauma meant. I thought trauma was something that happens if you go to war, in a foreign country. I didn't understand how, like, I misunderstood it greatly. So, and that misunderstanding really is the reason why I suffered that long. So hopefully I'll save someone some time and I'll save someone struggle if they watch this, because a lot of people who've got trauma don't even realize they've got it. They actually don't know that they are traumatized. And that's one of the trick trauma plays, because it it hides in shame, let's put it that way. And it's almost like we're trying to tell ourselves, no, I'm okay, as a way of trying to be okay. Anyways, so we'll talk about that, and also I'll share some of the solutions I've discovered in my journey, solutions for trauma, PTSD, and CPTSD. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, or some, and then CPTSD is complex PTSD. So PTSD can happen, let's say, because of one traumatic event, or maybe a bunch of traumatic events, but in a short period of time. Whereas CPTSD is what happens to people, especially when they've had adverse childhood experiences, and especially if they're growing up in a house where that state is maintained so for years. So imagine experiencing trauma for years. That's what causes what we call CPTSD, complex PTSD, because so the differentiation being the length of time one is exposed to traumatic whatevers. Now, before we move on, I just want to say I am not a doctor, I'm not a therapist. I have to say that for disclosure, for disclaimer. I'm simply another human being. I'm sharing this with you as a human being who has gone through similar, or maybe who's gone through this, and so that's why I'm sharing it. So, as from the point of view of somebody who's been through this and come out the other side. So, not as a therapist. Do not take anything I tell you as if it's coming from a doctor or a therapist. I do not wish to misrepresent myself and claim that I am. I am not. So now you know where this is coming from and from what position, is as a human being who's gone through it. Cool. Now, real quick, this is not a blame game, because blame games just end up nowhere good. And ultimately, actually blaming just makes things worse, It seems to make sense. And I'm not saying we should not assign responsibility to those who took certain actions for the actions they took back then. But that's simply saying, hey, you did that back then. That's enough. That's assigning responsibility. But then to go ahead and start blaming somebody for your life today, it sounds logical, but actually it takes away your ability to respond. So when you take away your responsibility, you take away your ability to respond. Your response ability goes when you take away responsibility. So it's one thing to say, this person did this to me back then, so that action belongs to them. That's assigning responsibility. But then to go and blame them for your life today, although it might sound logical, it's actually very counterproductive. So it's I want to sort of say that it's realizing that life happens, and life goes through a process, and we're all born into a story, and some of our families come from very difficult or rugged stories, and we're born into that story, so we just pick up the story from where it is and we carry on, something like that. So that's cool. And I don't think it's bad looking at, because we have to talk about family when we talk about trauma, especially ACEs. That's where most of the trauma comes from within the family, not outside. So you have to, and I don't think it's, to address that, it's not disrespectful, it's not disloyal, it is practical and generative. It's to say, look, our families are great, but there's parts of them which may have caused damage, and so we just want to address that damage and make things better. That's generative. It's not disrespectful, it's not disloyal. So I wanted to say that up front, because some people feel like it's shameful or disloyal for them to even consider that their family could be both good and great, and also bad and broken. But families are like that. It's normal. So I don't think it's disloyal. Anyways, moving on. Third, I want to say something to those people who genuinely don't have trauma. Because if you don't have trauma, you most likely cannot understand this. And if you cannot understand what a person who's going through trauma goes through, you may tend to fool yourself and say, why don't they just get over it? Why don't they just, come around? You know what I mean? And this is so rude, because trauma, for those people who haven't experienced it, they have no idea what kind of a problem it is. And they cannot have an idea of what kind of a problem it is. They have no idea how it debilitates and cripples a person internally, And so this "just get over it" statement is actually an insult, okay? And I'll give you a quick example. For example, I've got two newspaper clippings here up for you. One is one is in America, and the other one is in Australia. And basically, there is a huge concern. I just picked those two countries, but I'm sure it's quite, it's the same case around the world. But anyways, there's a huge concern in these two countries, because there are more soldiers that die at home from suicide because of PTSD than die during the war. And remember, these are hard men and women, hard fellows, trained people, hardcore. Yet they go to war, they don't die, they come back home, they are not dead. But their head is so fucked up with that PTSD that they kill themselves at home. Do you understand how powerful the forces of trauma are? They are not to be underestimated. So if you don't have trauma, all I can request is that don't belittle those who do. And just, what they need, people who are suffering under this, what they need is understanding. They don't need condemnation. They don't need the "I'm better than thou" attitude. So if you have somebody in your family or friends or whatever that have gone through this, have that compassion, because you cannot understand the inner workings of this monster unless you've been through it. Now, let's real quick define the difference. Actually, we already did this earlier on. The difference between PTSD and CPTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is usually caused by experiencing, witnessing, or listening to a one-time traumatic life event, or maybe even more than once, but maybe within a short period of time, like within a month. Let's say within one deployment at war, for example. Okay. And remember, what is traumatic to one person may not be traumatic to another person. And this, by the way, doesn't have. Some people say, there's a genetic component, but the bulk of it is not genetic. It's not about one person having bad genes and that's why they got traumatized, and the other one has good genes. That's a very, very rare case that is the case. Usually it's got nothing to do with weakness or with bad genes, okay? So that's PTSD. Again, it's one event, or maybe even if it's more than one event, but within, let's say, a short period of time, a week or a month or something. Whereas complex PTSD is like PTSD, but it is caused by ongoing trauma that can last months or even years. And usually this happens in childhood. And that is what we're going to focus on here, because that's what most people would probably be dealing with. Childhood related trauma, CPTSD. because there's very few people who actually have normal PTSD from, let's say, going to war compared to the number of people that have it from childhood. So we're going to deal with the childhood one. Well, that's what we're going to focus on. Now, we start with symptoms. There are 4 main categories of symptoms, okay? There's what we call intrusive symptoms. There's avoidance symptoms. There's arousal and reactivity symptoms. And there's also something called cognition and mood symptoms. When somebody has PTSD or CPTSD, these are the symptoms. So let's start with the intrusion symptoms. For example, you got something called flashbacks. Flashbacks is when, let's say you're a 40-something-year-old person. Let's say you're 47, 48-year-old male. And then something happens and triggers you and you fall back to thinking, feeling, and acting as if you're a 7-year-old boy. Now, the flashback is not necessarily visual. It's not necessarily that you're seeing a movie of what happened to you when you're 7 years old. No. The flashback is that your state, mental, emotional, self-perception, XYZ state, is dropped back to when you're 7 when that event happened. So you feel like you're back there. So it's not necessarily a flashback like you're watching a movie. There's probably no visual, but it's like your whole system is hijacked, okay? Other intrusive symptoms include nightmares, frightening thoughts, unwelcome, unwanted, frightening thoughts, okay? So those are examples of intrusive symptoms. Then you got avoidance symptoms. For example, you might, if you have trauma, you might end up avoiding certain people or certain kinds of situations or trying to avoid certain thoughts and feelings and so on. But the sum total, the thing to understand here is that avoidance, although it may provide temporary soothing, it actually creates bigger problems down the road and actually ends up limiting you. So avoidance is not a good strategy. It is self-soothing in the moment, but it's actually a very bad long-term strategy. So other symptoms of people who've gone through trauma include arousal and reactivity symptoms. For example, difficulty sleeping, feeling easily startled or jumpy, being hypervigilant, irritability, having trouble concentrating. So quite a lot of people who are so-called labeled with ADHD or whatever, or bipolar, sometimes when you reinvestigate, you realize they've got something else like CPTSD, for example. Anyways, and then the 4th category of symptoms are cognition and mood symptoms. This includes difficulty enjoying activities that you used to like, trouble remembering parts of the traumatic event or period, isolating from other people, ongoing feelings of fear, guilt, shame, and other negative emotions, persistent negative beliefs about yourself, the world, and other people. And where are we? Sorry, I just got confused here. Okay, so those are the 4 main categories of PTSD. Okay, symptoms, 4 main categories of both PTSD and CPTSD. So that's common to both. Now let's go to the symptoms that are particular to CPTSD. Okay, the long-term stuff, the childhood kind of stuff. So the CPTSD includes these ones that we just talked about, and also includes, in addition, difficulty managing emotions resulting in angry outbursts or intense sadness and so on, cannot self-regulate, and so they need to self-medicate to soothe the emotional storm. So self-medication can come through, let's say, workaholism, alcoholism, substance abuse, that kind of stuff. Anyways, and then more symptoms: persistent feelings of emptiness or hopelessness, relationship challenges such as trust issues, avoiding others, or participating in unhealthy dynamics, persistent negative beliefs about yourself, remaining involved in unhealthy relationships, engaging in high-risk behaviors, self-harming behavior, extreme startled response, very jumpy, intrusive, frightening thoughts, hypervigilance and always feeling on edge, irritability, difficulty concentrating, loss of interest in previously enjoyed activities, persistent feelings of fear, guilt, or shame, persistent beliefs that other people are bad or that the world is generally unsafe. So imagine having these symptoms and not knowing there's such a thing called trauma or CPTSD. What would you think? You'd think you're crazy, right? So that's where I was for so many years because I didn't even know what was happening. So I thought I was just broken and crazy because that list of symptoms is not funny, is it? But once you can name it and know what's going on with you and how it works and everything, and then you start practicing, especially mindfulness and that sort of stuff, and then all the other things that we're going to talk about, boom, suddenly this whole thing sort of downgrades in terms of suffering. Okay, moving on. Now let's talk about the costs and the causes. Hang on, I'm gonna have a sip of coffee. Thank you. So, the costs and causes. Now we're gonna use the United States Center for Disease Control, CDC. We're gonna use data from the CDC. So, what happened was the CDC has been collecting data on this kind of stuff from thousands of people over time. So this is, I think, the biggest data collection database we've got for this kind of stuff. So you can believe it, you can rely on it. This is thousands of people over time. So the CDC calls, it's given us a label here to go with, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, okay? Now, adverse childhood experiences are the primary cause of CPTSD. I want you to hear that. CPTSD is not a disease from germs or viruses or weird random shit, demons or whatever the hell it is. It comes from adverse childhood experiences. So these symptoms we've been talking about come from adverse childhood experiences when we're talking of CPTSD. Primarily, that's the most common cause. Now that include abuse, such as physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. It also includes neglect, including physical or emotional neglect. It also includes, let's say, being raised in a household that is very dysfunctional. So, for example, with mother or father or both have mental illness, or maybe they're incarcerated, they're in jail, or mother or maybe even father was treated violently over and over, or maybe there's substance abuse, maybe there's divorce. So there's a bunch of different factors that create this CPTSD sense. And now, still talking about costs and causes from the US CDC data, I'm gonna pick a few screens. There are many screens. If you go to their website, it's full. So I'm just gonna pick a few bits of data just to show you how expensive this thing is. So on average, people with 6 or more adult childhood experiences die nearly 20 years earlier than those with no ACEs. So first thing, life expectancy drops. That's how powerful trauma is. Then, the economic toll of ACEs. The estimated lifetime cost associated with child maltreatment in the US alone, at the time of this research, was $124 billion. Where does that money go? Lost productivity. How the fuck can you function when you're under these symptoms? Flashbacks, intrusive, you know what I mean? Frightening thoughts, irritability. Do you understand? It's just obvious. You're in flight or fright mode. You can't be productive in that state. So anyways, there's a healthcare cost, there's a special education cost, there's child welfare cost, there's criminal justice cost, and so on. So it's a very expensive thing. And now, we also know that ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, can have lasting effects on health, okay? Everything from obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide attempts, STDs, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, I don't know what that means, broken bones. The CDC has found correlations between number of ACEs and this stuff. Okay, behavior, smoking, alcoholism, drug use, life potential, graduation rates, academic achievement, lost time from work, all these things have been found to have a relationship with ACEs, okay? Then this pyramid is interesting. So at the bottom you start with conception, at the top is death. It's like the mechanism by which ACEs influence health and well-being throughout somebody's lifespan, okay? You get, for example, I'm gonna start at the fourth from bottom, disrupted neurodevelopment. So once you get this, let's start at the bottom. for example, in my family, we do know that we have generational and historical trauma, with a lot of violence from, up the generational whatever, how can you say it? Not violence, but also there's something else, the word I'm looking for. When you're orphaned and you sort of have to raise yourself from the age 8 or whatever. So these things happen to our grandparents, and the context, when you hear the history, it's very violent. How they grew up, and then how they raised their kids, and so on. So this is generational embodiment of the historical trauma, and then on top of that, you can layer social conditions or local context. Some societies are more violent than others, some are less caring than others, and so on. And then now on top of that, you layer on the childhood experiences. So for example, for me, social conditions, I remember being fearful almost every day of my childhood, because I was scared at home because of it was quite violent. In quotes, they call it discipline, but to be honest, it was just violence sometimes, without any reason. And that's weird for me to say that, because at the same time there was a lot of love and care and nurturing in that home, but the other times there would be this outburst of verbal, emotional, and physical violence that were just soul crushing, and you didn't know which one you'd get. Is it gonna be a good day, or is it gonna be a day where I'm burning inside and I'm in hell? So it's kind of hard. Now when you, on top of that, outside, when I was growing up, corporal punishment in school was normal. We used to get beaten like cows. Like literally, stroke, caning. Used to get caned on the butt, caned on the hands. There was also a lot of bullying, and also we grew up under dictatorship of a guy called President Moi, and a very brutal police kind of state back then. So it was scary outside the house and scary inside, and so you start to see how then number 4 on this pyramid, you get this disrupted neurodevelopment, and then on top of that you get this social, emotional, and cognitive impairment because of the disrupted neurodevelopment. You know what I mean? You don't get a chance as a child to complete your heightened arousal and then calm down sequences. You're always on heightened arrival. You're always pumping adrenaline. You're always, in other words, it's not a good idea to live under stress 24/7, especially as a kid. That's why ACEs are so powerfully detrimental. And so that goes on like that until at the top you get your early death thing, Now there's obviously nuances depending on people and how they take it. So, not two people will react the same way to the same response, but doesn't matter. The point is, this is how it works. So if you can identify anything like that in your own family line and everything, I don't think it's rude to call it out and say, this is what happened. Because you're not trying to say, it should have been different. You're recognizing that, wow, this shit can be generational. We're all born into an ongoing story. They could have started like 5 generations ago. So, it's almost as if you're understanding that this is impersonal in a way. But it's important to understand it and to call it out. All the same, there's no need to pretend, everyone was just fantastic 24/7, because then you'll feel like you're mad or you're broken. Because if everyone else was okay, why are you in this mess? Why do you have these symptoms if everyone was cool? Do you understand? So by sort of assigning responsibility to yourself, to everyone, whatever, but not really for blame, not really for revenge, not for any of that stupidity, I think it's a good idea. It's healthy even to talk about it. So, moving on, again, from the CDC, preventing ACEs could reduce a large number of health conditions. So in the US alone, up to 21 million cases of depression could be reduced or eliminated, up to 1.9 million cases of heart disease, and up to 2.5 million cases of obesity in the US alone could be reduced if you reduce or prevent ACEs. So you see, the costs are extremely high. It's not a joke, this thing. And a lot of people are trying to create their reality and to create their life in a certain way, and they wonder why they keep getting messed up and they can't get ahead. And I'm not saying it's always the case, but for quite a few people, the case is this. See these symptoms we're talking about? It's very difficult to create a thriving life with these symptoms running through you every now and then, every day or every other day or whatever. So it's a very expensive thing, and it needs to be understood and taken seriously. But the good thing is that you can actually come out of it. There is a healing journey, and the healing journey comes from a place where you have these extreme burdens. See these symptoms we talked about? They're called burdens. These are called burdens because they really are burdensome. So you come from a place where the healing journey is where you're letting go of these burdens, or rather you're reducing. So you come from extreme burdens to minimal burdens. So I don't want to promise you go to zero burdens. Some people do, but usually they just become minimal, So you come from a place where you are a fragmented self to a place where you're a holistic self, an integrated self, an integral self. In other words, you got structural integrity as a psyche, because trauma fragments the psyche. And then your perceptions, they come from being warped and all messed up and confused to where you're seeing things clearly, true perception. And then you come from a place where you've got dysregulated emotions and thoughts to a place where you've got self-regulated emotions and thoughts. And you come from a place where you've got a broken sense of self to a place where you've got a healthy sense of self. And also high self-esteem, from low self-esteem to high self-esteem. Trauma really messes self-esteem. So then you come from a place where your system is stuck on fight, flight, freeze loops to a place where the system is at rest. It's got homeostatic balance and it's calm and all that, okay? So it's not stuck in survival mode. Fight, flight, freeze is survival mode. You don't want to be stuck on survival mode. This is a bad idea. Because you cannot thrive from a place of survival. It's just not possible. Anyway, so that's the healing journey, and it's possible to heal. Now let's talk about healing solutions. How do you heal from this trauma stuff, right? So I gotta say, I personally have never found a magic bullet. Maybe it exists. I hope it does. It would be nice. But I've never found a magic bullet. In other words, I've never found a single solution to this. I found that it needs a combination of relational, external help, and self-help. Relational help, external help, and self-help. Now let's talk about relational first. What I mean by this is that being seen and heard is important. Some call it verbal ventilation, okay? Being understood, okay? In other words, for you to find somebody who's safe enough to talk to, and you talk to them and they hear you and they go, now that makes sense. They don't even have to talk back. They don't have to give you a solution. That's not the point. They don't need to even be able to understand enough to tell you, yeah, you know what you should do. No, that's not the point. The point is, it's somebody to hear you, and then that way you can hear yourself talking to somebody, and this person goes, yeah, that makes sense. So that makes you realize you're not crazy, because one of the things that people who cause trauma do is they gaslight their victims. Gaslighting means telling their victim, somebody says, for example, I'm feeling confused, or I'm feeling whatever the hell you tell a person who's causing you trauma, they will try and make you think that you're wrong. That no, the perceptions you've got of your own internal system is wrong. So you tell them, I'm feeling this. They might tell you, that's not important, or that's actually not that feeling, it's this. Or you'd say, I'm thinking this. Oh no, you shouldn't be thinking that. You should be thinking this. Or this is my experience, and then they try and negate your experience. So this is called gaslighting. It's crazy making. Makes you crazy. Makes you feel like you're stupid and crazy, and that increases the problem. So you don't want to talk to your tormentors, because that's kind of like negotiating your malaria problem with the mosquito. You can't go to the mosquito to tell it, hey, you gave me malaria, let's talk about that. The mosquito is the mosquito. It's supposed to give you malaria. You know what I mean? So we're not saying go back and challenge those people that you feel caused you trauma. If at all you do have trauma, it would be nice if they're willing to have an open, good, healthy discussion. But if they're not, don't go to them. Go to somebody else who's safe and can hear you and validate you without really encouraging you to stay there, because you don't want to get stuck there. You know, you don't want to make this your new identity, a song. Oh yeah, I'm the traumatized guy, let me tell everybody. Because then that's actually counterproductive and people will get bored of it too. So you don't want to get stuck there, but you do need 1 or 2 verbal ventilations so you can feel understood. And then again, social support, just having safe people. They don't have to be doctors or therapists. They don't need to be able to take care of you or fix you, but they're just safe and they're supportive and they're there, you know. They don't even need to be able to help you directly with your trauma. Just having them around is good. And also change environment. Don't stick around in the same environment that triggers you like hell. Remember, every time you get triggered, you go into this set of symptoms. You get flashbacks, what. So you want to change your environment to one that doesn't have those triggers. That's part of healing. You gotta have an environment that doesn't have the triggering reminders or people or signals. You know, it's very hard to heal if you sit in the same environment. Now let's talk about external help. You can go to psychologists and psychiatrists, for example. They are one part of the puzzle, but they are not the total answer. I've met some people, especially medical practitioners. They ridiculously think that one psychologist or one psychiatrist will sort you out forever. It doesn't work like that. They're just part of the puzzle. They are very important, but I've never found one that can be a total answer. They'll even tell you, look, I can't help you with everything. I can help with X, Y, and Z. So definitely good to see a professional, but don't ignore everything else we're talking about, because a professional is just one piece of the puzzle. If you assume that, oh, I'm going to get rid of all the relational social support, I don't need that, I don't need X, Y, Z, I don't need all these other things because I got a psychiatrist, you're likely going to suffer. You know, they'll help you, but they can't help with everything. So it's also important to realize that trauma is still largely misunderstood. You know, just like the brain, even the best brain surgeons don't fully understand the brain. Even the best heart surgeons don't fully understand the heart. The brain is very largely unknown, and trauma is still being sort of, how can I say it? Most psychologists and most psychiatrists actually don't understand trauma. You know, you can go to university, get your degree for psychology or psychiatry, and still not understand trauma. In other words, you need somebody who has also taken additional specializations after they graduated out of university to get their psychology or psychiatric whatever certification. You need somebody it's called trauma aware. Those are additional qualifications, additional certifications, because trauma is kind of new. I mean, it's ancient, but the understanding is so new that just because you're a psychologist, psychiatrist, doesn't mean you understand it. Okay, you could have heard about it, you could think you know it, but the depth and the nuances of how it operates, most don't know. Sorry to say. So find somebody who's trauma aware, a professional who's got the trauma aware qualification or whatever. It's nice, in fact, very, very, I would say crucial, that they also have EMDR certification. EMDR is one of the best modalities for healing trauma, EMDR. So they need to have that. Now, those are the two things I would say are must-have: trauma aware and EMDR specialization. Again, this doesn't come automatically with a university degree. It's an additional thing that they gotta take. Now, above and beyond that, it's also nice if your professional that you found also understands a modality called CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, DBT, or CPT. Okay, they're sort of related but different. And CPT is very powerful. I really love CPT, but also CBT and DBT is good. It's also good if they understand something called internal family systems, IFS, because, like we said, trauma fragments the self into parts, and many of those parts are in conflict with each other internally. That's why you have some of those symptoms we looked at. So these parts, that's what we're calling the internal family system. So we're not talking about the external family. We're talking about within the person, you got parts. These parts are what is called internal family. So you need to understand. You need somebody who can guide those parts, tease them out so they can come out, because many of them are hiding, pretending to be something else, because remember, they were fragmented and divorced. That happens with trauma. That's why even you can't remember certain things. So when they come back to conscious awareness, they start to integrate, and that kind of releases them having to do all this stuff in the background. What I'm trying to say is that, you see these symptoms we talked about? That very often is the different parts. So one part is 7 years old and stuck in that traumatic whatever, so that's what causes a flashback. Another part is like doing hypervigilance, because that's another part that's trying to fight against the other part that's having the flashbacks. That's kind of like how the fragmentation works. It's funny, not funny. Yeah. So anyways, so another technique, so IFS, another technique that would be nice to have but don't have to have is MAC and ACT. So the first two must have, trauma aware, EMDR. The others, very nice to have if you can get it, but it's sometimes often tricky to find a therapist who has all this. So it would be unreasonable to expect that you'll find many therapists with all of these qualifications. But anyway, it's good to try. And then the other external help you can have is drugs, or rather medicines, or medicines and drugs, because there's some so-called illegal drugs that are sort of proving to be very helpful. But whether they're legal or illegal, whether it's the pharmaceuticals or it's, marijuana, weed, or it's bloody ecstasy, or microdosing on, mushrooms, or, DMT. There's so many things that people are doing that are really working. Some of them are categorized in quotes legal. Some are categorized in quotes illegal. I'm not here to tell you which one to take. I'm just saying, even if you go to Netflix, there's a movie on this, and you'll see that there's a lot of amazing results coming out of the so-called illegal ones, such as DMT and mycelium, or whatever it's called, some kind of fungus, or microdosing on that, or microdosing on ecstasy. But I'm not giving medical advice. I'm just telling you there's a Netflix documentary on this as well. So but it doesn't matter, whatever drugs you choose, you have to understand that they are only useful for temporary regulation of a dysregulated state. The drugs themselves cannot cure trauma by themselves, because all they do is minimize the signal. In other words, they minimize the symptom. They don't have, a chemical cannot cure a heart matter. And by heart, I don't mean like physical heart. I'm talking matters of the heart, emotions, thoughts, whatever. The chemical can provide maybe a missing hormone. So for example, if you're low on serotonin, a chemical can bring that back up, so you feel good, better, not so depressed, which makes you available to now listen to the therapist or read the book and help yourself. But the drugs by themselves, they won't cure. They'll only assist. They're like a crutch, okay, which is good. Then another thing that qualifies under external help is prayer and divinity, or spiritual healing. And it's very important. Now, I won't spend much time here because people watching this can be from all kinds of religions, whatever. I don't have a religion. I'm very spiritual, but I don't do religion. And so I cannot say how to pray, or which God to pray, or which religion to join. To me, it doesn't matter. But I'm sure there are people who will disagree with that. To me, it doesn't really matter where you belong. As long as you believe in a benevolent higher power looking after you, and you communicate with it, whatever you call it, I think it helps. In any case, I'm not saying I think it helps. It's proven scientifically that prayer and divinity, and not a particular religion necessarily, but just in general, prayer and divinity is important and helps. Very important. So whichever flavor you pick of that, at least do it. Okay? So the other thing, we're still continuing with healing solutions, is what we call self-help. So we're done with the external. Now let's talk about the self-help. Mindfulness. I can tell you for a fact You cannot heal without mindfulness. I mean, even all the healing modalities, like here we're talking about CBT, DBT, CPT, ACT, MAC, all those have mindfulness in them, built in. So you have to. And the more you learn mindfulness for yourself, beyond, above and beyond what, let's say, your therapist might be teaching you, the better. So mindfulness is so important, so important, so important. And we've got a whole course on our platform called Radical Mindfulness. Take that course. It really goes deep into this. Very important. Does a lot to help and heal. And you got shadow work, which means embracing your shadow. It's also very important when you can do that. Then you've got books. The more you can read books, the more you'll understand your situation and why things are happening. So there's a particular community of authors that have come up. Many of them suffered trauma, and they use their own suffering to write some of the best books. You got guys like Gabor Mate, guys like Peter Walker, and there's a few others, right? So read. It helped me so much, and I was usually using Audible so I can listen to the book as an Audible. But by understanding what's going on with trauma, I was like, oh, so that's happening. That's what's happening inside me. Oh, I recognize that pattern. Oh, so I'm not crazy. Oh, now I know how to stick a finger in that pattern so it doesn't, trigger more and more, or I know how to interrupt that pattern, or whatever it is, So it's very important to read and understand, get your own understanding, because even if you've got a therapist, a good one, maybe they see you once for 45 minutes every week or every 2 weeks. What's that? Nothing. I mean, it's good, but it's nothing. You know what I mean? If you read on top of the therapy, it adds so much more power. Cultivating emotional vulnerability and emotional intelligence is also very powerful, very important. This is another skill you can learn. Reparenting the inner self or the inner child, because trauma quite often comes the very bad, negative, critical inner judge, and a judge, an inner critic. In other words, you internalize your parents, you internalize your society, you internalize the very things that may have been good to you but also traumatize you. And so that internalized voice becomes this inner critic that is very harsh, and that keeps triggering every now and then. You see, like these symptoms we talked about a bunch of symptoms. They're all triggered. Quite often the trigger has become internalized. The trigger is no longer only outside in the environment, it also has become internalized. For example, internalized as the parental voice or as the whatever. So you can trigger yourself into very bad states in your mind. See? So when you reparent that yourself or your inner child, it's kind of like you're getting rid of the trigger, the inner critic, and you're replacing them with a compassionate, self-caring, internalized parent, one that encourages you and talks to you well and supports you rather than criticizes you. Because if you've internalized a critic, then it will keep triggering you negatively. That's just what it is. Okay. Another thing that can help is yoga. Okay, yoga is great because it kind of like I don't know, it releases the places where you're stuck and it connects where you're disconnected. So yoga is good. It's a very good exercise. It's been proven to help people with trauma stuff. And then creating a future vision, envisioning your future in a positive way, is very important, because then, especially when you've painted it clearly, that future vision will pull you forward into goodness, and it will help you avoid being pulled forward by the default negative, dark future vision that is often generated by trauma. Trauma literally runs. Trauma tells you that something bad's about to happen. It's like, in that movie Jaws, where there's the shark sound, like dun 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 dun, and the shark is coming, it's gonna come and eat somebody, but you cannot see the shark, but because of that music, somebody's about to be killed by the shark, and like dun 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 dun. That's trauma. That's the future vision that trauma generates, that there's somebody out to get me. Oh, something calamity is about to happen. Oh, I'm about to, one or another, been bad problems or something, you know? So anyways, so you need to write down a compelling, deliberate future vision that is positive, so it can sort of counter the default negative future vision generated by trauma. And then another thing that can help is when you rewrite your past, your history, into one of victory instead of victimhood. For example, there's a guy called Viktor Frankl. He's very well known for a book called, I think, Man's Search for Meaning or In Search of Meaning. And what Viktor did was he got caught up by the Nazis and put in a concentration camp. And on day one, I think they killed his wife. And then, just concentration camp living is just bad business, right? So while most of the other people in that camp, their history or their past was one of a victim. I got captured, I'm about to be killed, or life is terrible. Viktor rewrote it and said, oh, this is good research material for me to figure out the meaning of life and XYZ. And so he positioned himself as a victor going through some tough times. Yes, traumatic tough times, but with a purpose such that it is because of those tough times that he's able to reach his purpose. So in other words, he repositioned himself as a victor instead of a victim, so that he repositioned that historical story, his past, into like a food for greatness, like a training camp, like a, oh, I'm so glad this happened because now I know XYZ, or because it set me up for the future whereby I'm gonna do XYZ or whatever. So you can rewrite your past, leave the events as they are, but give them different interpretation. One of victory instead of victimhood. And that helps. Over time, it slowly rewires your brain. So you're no longer thinking, oh man, all this bad shit happened to me, in other words, it's more like you start think, oh man, I was raised in a elite military school or something, I don't know. You can come up with a way to reposition that story. And finally, you and your efforts and your decisions are the most important part of the solution. What you tell yourself, the decisions you make, the efforts you make, they're more important than the drugs you might get, or the yoga, or the therapist. You are the most important component of all this, okay? So it's very, very important. And I just want to remind you again, the blame game is not a good place to get stuck on. You have to take responsibility for your healing. And yes, whatever happened to you, the person who did X to you in the history back then was responsible for what they did back then. That's true. And it's true. And you can say healthily blame them for that. In other words, you're not blaming them. You're saying, dude, you did X. That is the fact. You did X. Blame is different. Blame is like, oh, because you did X, now I'm like this today. So you're trying to make them responsible for how you are today. And it might sound logical, but actually it's bad business. It's a bad idea, because today you are 100% responsible for your healing. Doesn't matter how you got broken, you are 100% responsible for your healing today. So when you start blaming, it's kind of like you're throwing away that power to heal today. You see? You know what I mean? So you just hurt yourself when you get into the blame game. Okay? The most blame could go is just to say, hey, you did this X many years ago, and it was your action. And then that's it. You don't need to then carry it forward into the present and keep blaming them for what's going on today to you today. You see? So, here are some gates I would say you must pass through in your journey to healing. At some point, you got to go through radical acceptance. Acceptance and mindfulness are a gateway that you sort of have to go through if you wish to heal. Forgiveness. But then look, forgiveness, you got to be like sort of, be careful with this. A lot of people think, oh, I'll forgive this person so I can be healed. That's kind of cute, but forgiveness can be premature even. You know what I mean? Forgiveness is a state whereby you genuinely feel within you you're no longer a victim. It's kind of married to this blame game and the I can't remember where we were. Anyways, forgiveness is a place where genuinely inside you, it's kind of like you've released the whole thing. So it's not necessarily okay. One level of forgiveness is where you go pick up the phone or meet somebody face to face and tell them, "I forgive you." That's cool. That's cute. That's good to do. But real forgiveness is actually when your system inside no longer is got the hang-ups. It's literally let go. So forgiveness is literally transformational, literally. And the faster you can forgive, the better. But what I'm trying to do is trying to make you not try and fake it. It's not about saying sorry. It's not the words "I'm sorry" that matter. It is the internal recognition that you're not damaged from that thing. Or even if you are, it's part of the process of life, or it's not personal, it's impersonal. Whatever, there's something that has happened. So your internal structure is, all right, I'm okay, you're okay. That's it. I'm okay, you're okay. And internally you feel it. That's real forgiveness. It's not verbalizing the words "I'm sorry." But although that helps, that's also good. So do it. Okay, another gateway is radical honesty. It's very hard to heal when you're lying to yourself. So at some point you'll get to radical honesty, just like you get through to radical acceptance. You're gonna have to understand and study, because if you don't understand the problem and you don't know thyself, you gotta know thyself. It's harder to heal. So that's why I think it's important. The less you dodge studying and understanding, the more you heal, or the faster you heal. And then you gotta do the work. Healing is work to be done. So you gotta make deliberate decisions and work on, let's say, your mindfulness, work on your, getting help, doing whatever your therapist is saying, you gotta do the work yourself. It's very important. So these are some of the gates I think everybody must pass through. And finally, I wanna say this to certain people or anyone, because I've met a lot of people who are in denial. They literally are traumatized, but they pretend they're not. So there's a saying that goes, hurt people hurt other people. So a human being that has been traumatized but is in denial, who's pretending to be okay when they're actually not okay. How do we know they're not okay? Because they're flashing these symptoms left, right, and center. Where are those symptoms? They got them. You see, they got many of these symptoms. And then they act like they're okay. What will happen is that they'll go and hurt and damage other people, usually within their own family. And it's almost guaranteed to happen, because hurt people end up hurting people, because unresolved trauma always explodes on innocent bystanders. Somebody who just happens to be around you. You're going to explode on them. And usually the people who are around you are your own family. So I thought I'd throw that in there, because there's some people who, out of fear to approach and sort the problem, they live in denial. And they think that's a solution. It's not a solution. It blows up anyways. People can see through it, and it makes it very difficult to have relationships. So it's not a solution. It's a dodge that kind of doesn't work. Anyways, I thought I would mention that. So thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. And I hope you do not have trauma. But if you do, I hope you take steps. And I hope this has been very illuminating. Thank you.